Okay, we'll go ahead and, good morning. We'll call this public hearing on proposed desired future conditions for Prairie Range GCD. Sinclair, would you call those, please?
Director Besato,
Here.
Director Kirk, Director Osborne, Director Tischler, Director Smith, Director McPherson, Director Curtis.
Here.
We have a quorum present.
Thank you, Sinclair. Move on to item number 3, receive summary presentation, proposed desired future conditions of the district's consultant hydrologist.
Hey, James, while you're getting warmed up there, we'll just note for the record that this is the hearing received from section 36 of the APT, that's the water code, and the notice was this hearing was provided as required under that section 36.063 of the water code. The DFCs are available for inspection in the office and website. Public comment period will remain open today's hearing. Written comments until 14th. In GMA 8, the districts that are circled are where there were changes in the pumping for run 10, which resulted in run 11, and or the focus of the changes for the DFCs. So let's run through those real quickly, starting with Upper Trinity. And let me go back just a little bit. You can see, obviously, y'all made some changes, not to the total volume of pumping, as you remember, but to vertical distribution of pumping in the Hensel and Austin. And so the districts around you that have made changes, McLennan, Upper Trinity, Bell County, all of those have some impact on the counties around them. And so we're seeing some changes in the DFCs. And obviously, even your shift in pumping vertically has made some changes locally and beyond that. So in the Upper Trinity GCD, after looking at their production history and all of their permits that they've got and production history historically, they wanted to change their anticipated pumping from run 10 there, which was about 37,000 acre feet, 937,961 acre feet, to increase that by 11,000 to 49,000 acre feet. So a pretty significant change, and you can see where those changes are occurring. by aquifer and county there. Obviously, that type of an increase has impact on county, not just these counties, but the counties around. Southern Trinity GCD did not change their predicted pumping into the future, but for the past 10 years, they realized that the assumptions for Run 10 that you see in the left column there for the Austin were significantly higher than what they measured over the last and documented over the last 10 years. So they made changes between 2010 and 2019. And then on the last row of this table, you can see from 2020 to 2080, they made no changes. So the predicted part of their simulation was the same moving forward after 2020. In prairie lands, some of you remember you reduced pumping from Run 10 in the Hensel quite a bit, and from 3,600 to 397. That's partly due to what you've learned about allocation of production and what we've learned from the GAM and how the wells are permitted and how we're tracking that. More of the production was moved to the Pearsall and the Austin based on what we know today. The total production moving forward is the same as it was. It's just moved down from the Hensel to the Pearsall and Austin. Clearwater, we've got a similar change, not that big of a change materially, only 27 acre feet, but a little bit of a shift from the Glen Rose to the Hensel there. Central Texas GCD to again a pretty small change, but just a shift vertically. Travis County, which there's no district there, but there was estimates made for increased pumping there from 4,900 to 6,600. That work was done by the surrounding groundwater districts, Central Texas and Clearwater. And so you have an increase there. You have a slight increase also in Williamson County, another county close to Austin that does not have a district. So we're going to run through the Run 11 results for the DFC in a tabular form. And these are changes between Run 10 and Run 11. When you see blue numbers, that means water levels are increasing. You're not going to see many of those. You'll see some, but mostly you'll see red positive values, which means you're having a slightly greater drawdown. That makes sense because we've increased pumping in most places. And so if we were flipping through counties here in alphabetical order throughout all of GMA 8, so you can, we'll stop here at Coriel. You see that there's a few feet of change in Travis Peak and Austin. If you remember, the Travis Peak is a combination of the Hensel, Austin, Pearsall, and so that's what it's represented here as kind of a combination of those two. If we go to the next page, we see Ellis at the top of Ellis County at the top of the table there, and you can see the numbers in Twin Mountain, Travis Peak, Austin, significantly higher. Again, part of that is due to increased pumping overall, and then the shift from Hensel to Pearsall and Austin. There's a little bit of a change in the Hensel. Remember, you've got effects from Upper Trinity, you've got effects from other places coming in as well with regard to why the changes are all, increased drawdown in this case. For Hill County, you can see there again, 55-foot increase in the level of drawdown in 2080, this is a combination of a comparison to 2070, and then in Austin you've got 64 foot of additional drawdown. So this is increased drawdown 50 years from today. So that's what you're looking at with the shift in pumping and the increase in pumping around GMA 8 according to the model. Johnson County, you can see a similar result there, and you actually see a little bit of positive response, a blue number there for the Hensel, because of that shift away from the Hensel and more pumping into it. And now so when we look at the entire results for run 11, and you look at the total amount of drawdown as predicted by the model from 2010 to 2080, what you see here is again numbers potentially in the hundreds of foot. Let's start with we've got Ellis here. Ellis at the top. We're talking about 380 foot of drawdown in Travis Peak, 290 in the Hensel, 390 foot in the Austin. And if you go to Hill, on average in Travis Peak, 365, Johnson County, 235. In the Austin for Johnson County, you're looking at 329. Austin, Hill County, 413. Austin and Ellis County, 390. So those are the long-term total drawdown that you're going to see from water levels in a well on average in those counties. Let's say in the Austin, that's the average drawdown around the county you're going to see in water levels in wells. According to the model predictions, based on the production that we're anticipating. So you probably remember the Texas graphic that GMA 8 has a lot of historical drawdowns that are showing 500, 600, 800 foot of drawdown in the general area, prairie lands and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. You can see that drawdown is not going to stop based on the predictions that we're making here. We're continuing to see drawdowns, and that's what's predicted by the model. We'll go into a little bit of some of the impacts of that as we move forward. We'll show you what impact that has on wells in a little more detail later. But this is just a summary of total drawdowns moving forward. And that's why, the districts are in place because, there is going to be continued drawdown and management of those opportunities. Sure, let's do that. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip over that. Somerville, for Twin Mountain, 50, Travis Peak, 64, and total drawdown in the Hensel, 17, 120 foot in the Austin. Again, this is for this is predicted from the model. And let's go back and look at the delta. Okay, we got a little bit of an increase in the Hensel due to the shift in pumping, and then an increase in Travis Peak, 11 feet increase in 35. Sorry about that, Marty, didn't mean to slap you there. And then there's quite a few up dip, down dip numbers here for okay, so now we're jumping into a presentation that was made by me on October 27th, back when I was with WSP. Basically, this is the exact same presentation that was made at GMA 8, and I'm just going through it here. Again, the reason, and Mr. Pledge can comment on this potentially with regard to the process, but the GMA and all the districts at the GMA decide on what the proposed DFCs are. Then whatever the proposed DFCs are, it all goes back to the districts. You have hearings in each one of the districts. That's what we're doing. We're running through all of the 9 factors and all of the decision making that went into coming up with those those proposed desired future conditions. And we're running through some of that logic and the 9 factors here at your hearing so that you can be apprised of some of the thought process that went on for the last 3 years, or at least 2.5 years at GMA 8. All of you have not been, I mean, we've given you updates along the way. Charles has been there. Kathy's been there. Brian's been there, been listening. And so this is another opportunity at your local hearing and for the public to hear what the decision process was, what all the factors were that went into contemplating how to move forward with managing GMA 8 and 3. So that's what the agenda item was there on October 27th. And you all are familiar with the grandiose balancing act that Chapter 36 calls for as far as coming up with the DFC. There is there's a balance between finding the highest practicable level of groundwater production and conserving and preserving. And you guys here in Prairie Lands are very familiar with the give and take of people needing water and wanting water for the future, wanting groundwater for the future, and conserving and preserving for the future as well. And that's what the whole desired future condition is about, and that's what all the simulations are about, and that's why the state also requires you to look at 9 different factors and how they play into the DFC and how the DFC affects all of these things. This is a summary of what you find in Chapter 36 with regard to DFCs and what the requirements are for you to assess when you're making your decision. Very important decision about what the desired future conditions are, what the levels in the aquifer are going to be, and how that might affect how you permit and how you manage the aquifer. So the 9 factors include environmental impacts, subsidence impacts, hydrologic conditions, aquifer uses and conditions, supply needs and management strategies. That has a lot to do. That particular one has a lot to do with how the state is planning with the regional water planning groups to supply the needs, the unmet needs of the region. And so, we assess those things. Private property rights in Chapter 36. The private property rights are talking largely about the balance between those that need to use the water, want access to the groundwater underneath their property. And there's lawyers that can go on for days about this, right? Sledge about in regards to how to balance private property rights of those who need access and want access and to their groundwater rights under their property, and those that want to conserve. In the socioeconomic impacts, DFC feasibility, and any other relevant information that's there. So those we're just going to run through briefly. Again, when we stepped through all of these factors at GMA 8, you can see the dates at the top of each one of those 3 different rows. Back in November of 2019, we looked at the first 3. In February of 2020, almost a year ago now, we looked at the middle 3, and then in May of 2020, we looked at the last 3. And so that was sort of the sequence of discussing these issues in a lot of detail. What we're going to go through today is just a very high level summary of what was considered at GMA 8 and allow for you and others to comment on that and provide discussion on that. So one of the things that we did look at with environmental impacts in the last round of planning, and let me slow down just for a second and explain another important factor for kind of how the work was done in this round of planning. About 3 years ago, when we finished up the previous DFCs and the explanatory report was written, there were 10 official runs done. That's why we ended up with run 10 in the previous round of planning. Run 10 was the culmination of a lot of thought processes, a lot of different assumptions about modeling, where pumping was going, how much pumping was here, there, and everywhere, how much impact that had on a lot of different things, including outcrop, spring flow, all of the different flow throughout the aquifer. A lot of that stuff was assessed in those 10 runs. When the process started in this round of planning, the districts as a whole said, we don't see huge changes coming. We see minor changes in all of those runs that we did and spent a lot of money, invested a lot of time to make those 10 runs and to learn what we could from those runs. So there was only minor tweaks. So we went from run 10 to run 11, which is what we just looked at. It was the results of run 11 and the changes between those. And so one of the things on the environmental impact statements that we looked at was just how much, what the changes were and impacts to run 10, because the changes to run 11 weren't going to be that much different. One of the things that was looked at in more detail was impacts to spring flow. We know that production from the aquifers, especially on the outcrop, this is a map of the springs that are, have historically existed in GMA 8, and you can see a lot of those are on the outcrop of the Woodbine, outcrop of the Trinity up here, and then the antler, a lot in the antlers, and then of course Trinity and Edwards down here closer to Austin. So one of the things that we looked at in more detail at GMA 8 was the impact to those springs from the pumping. We know there was impact, and so in the last round of planning in run 10 and again in run 11, the decision was made. We know we're going to have impact. Those decisions have been made in light of the impact to springs according to the modeling results. The southern portion of GMA has the greatest density of springs, but obviously there's a lot of smaller springs on the outcrop in the northern area as well. The largest springs are from the Edwards Balcones fault zone around Salado and close to Austin, and then as far as those outcrop springs, much as you saw on the map, much of those are kind of on the outcrop. Some of those are what we term as like locally fed springs, where you've got precipitation, you've got recharge locally, and they find their way to local springs and streams. It's not a deep movement of water from or to deeper parts of the aquifer and then springing up. We did have, back 100 years ago, you had a lot of artesian wells and well-documented springs or flowing wells because of that. But what we're talking about here is mainly just spring discharge and stream flow. Run 11 impacts to springs and streams are very similar to what we saw in run 10 because the changes weren't that great. So that's really the takeaway that was considered at GMA 8. There's small changes due to increased pumping, but very much similar to what we saw in run 10. And so again, one of the underlying premises of this whole round of planning has been, we're going to minimize the number of runs, minimize all the work that was done, because we've just looked at all of this pretty exhaustively a few years with the new model. Subsidence impacts, we ran through how that looks across the state, how it looks in GMA 8 and major and minor aquifers, and visualizing some of that risk. Some of y'all may remember that we looked at a few examples here in Prairie Lands, including Rocket Special Utility District, Penelope, Aquila, or however you say that name. How do you say that, Charlie? Aquila. All right, got it right. So the minimum and maximum subsidence estimates, range from 0.6 feet to up to about 6 feet, and that's including all of the predictive water level decline at the end of 2080, and that's with a fairly simplified tool, statewide tool that the Water Development Board developed. So the varies from place to place, and it determined by compressibility of those clays, which we had some data for those, but not a lot in this area. So those are estimates of subsidence moving forward to 28. Hydrologic conditions. This is that picture of drawdown, maximum drawdown, historically that I was talking about earlier, where you see the big red area in prairie lands and in the area there, GMA 8. And so we know that that's occurred in the past by predictions from the model and the predicted uses for the aquifers. Some of those drawdowns are going to continue, and you've seen some of those predicted numbers over time. So what we did was we looked at all the data in the Water Development Board database, which groundwater districts generally are bringing all that data together. The Water Development Board gathers some of that data. They also count on groundwater districts to submit a lot of that data from y'all's efforts. And we, made all of that data available through hydrographs. Here's just an example of what it looks like when we have the right information to put the well casing and well screen intervals on the diagram on the left portion of the graph there. You can see the Northern Trinity Woodbine Gam aquifer designation kind of in color around the wells. This particular well screens the Austin Formation. And then on the right, you can see the hydrograph, which in this case starts in 1960, I think, if I'm reading that correctly, and goes up through almost present day. And so you can see the water level decline in that particular well in Hill County. And so there were hundreds of these hydrographs that were put together and made available to districts to look at so that they could assess what's going on as far as measured data in the actual aquifer. So one thing to stop and recount here is everything we're doing for the desired future conditions is we're using the models to predict what's going to happen as best we can. And we're using that as a tool for you all to make, and policymakers to try to make decisions about what those impacts are going to be. And so the model is a tool to look forward and say, let's let that tool help us make decisions. What your DFC actually, how your DFC will be determined is with real data like this. And that's why we want to show you this real data. And that's why you're developing a monitoring plan. You're hiring field people to go out and get good information and sort bad information out for good information, and to always keep adding to the wells that you're monitoring so you know more about the aquifers, because it's the real data, the real drawdown that will be used to determine if you're meeting your DFC into the future. So there's this modeling component that's a tool for looking forward. And then there's the real data that you actually use to kind of, see how you're doing to meet those projected DFCs. And in time, just like we always have done in the past, when we see that we've got an accumulation of good information, whether it's water levels, pumping test data, aquifer parameter, water quality, whatever it might be, we try to improve those models so that you'll have better tools to make decisions moving forward. So just a couple of examples of those hydrographs here. And then you can see these are the water wells that have good hydrographs in the Woodbine aquifer throughout GMA 8. And here's the ones with Hensel. And you might just, this is Collin County, and just an example illustration on the map of where those wells exist in the Woodbine sand. Okay, another thing that we look at, what's required by Chapter 36, is what's called the TERS, or the total estimated recoverable storage. That is an estimate of all of the water in the aquifer. If you just drain the whole thing from top to bottom, how much water would be there? The Water Development Board has been through those calculations years ago, really haven't changed much. And so there's the pendulum swings from TERS being a maximum water or an estimate of like the maximum drainable water from an aquifer to more of what you're calculating with the model as far as like an artesian head or a tensiometric head or a water level decline over time. Most of the volumes that you see in as far as percent of actual volume used from an aquifer in your DFCs, and then from the volumes that you're pumping, is a pretty small percentage of the actual volume in the aquifer. The TERS is the pendulum swinging completely the other way. Let's not worry about where the water is in the well. Let's just drain the whole aquifer. That's what you get from these TERS numbers. Now, the Water Development Board has estimated that total drainable volume, which you can't even physically get out of the aquifer with wells, obviously. And they've said, okay, well, let's look at 25% as some reasonable number and 75%. So that's sort of what you see in the tables that they present. Here's the TERS values for the Trinity Aquifer in GMA 8. You can, let's start in Ellis County. You can see that 25% of that total volume is 19 million acre feet, 58 million acre feet is 75% of that TERS value. So again, these values are limited in their usability for most management for the fact that you can't really gather all of this water per se with wells. It doesn't really speak to water quality. It doesn't really speak to productivity of the wells with time. And so we know that production drops off even as water levels drop to the top of the aquifer and you start declining after that. And so that's this fine balance between looking at these very big numbers in storage and what actually occurs when you produce much smaller volumes. You get another 300, 400, 500 foot of water level decline, which is what we're going to see as predicted by the model. But the TERS are there for review and for sort of another perspective on volume and storage. And then these are just the aquifers. The other one here that is a concern to you is Woodbine on the right, looking at let's say Johnson County. You're seeing from 1 to 3 million acre foot in storage, not nearly as big as the Trinity, but similarly larger number. Okay, so if you look at the types of pumping that you see in GMA 8, I think this is interesting. This is for the 5 years from 2014 through 2018. This is the best data that the Water Development Board has gathered. Some of it from y'all, some of it from other approaches. And municipal use is the largest use there, almost 60%. 32% goes to irrigation, and then smaller estimates for livestock manufacturing, 1% from mining. Mining does include oil and gas. Yes. That's just anything basically used for the crops. No, that would be generally lumped into municipal. And rural domestic, which is not really broken out that way. So let's see. Okay, so that's the 5 year, that's the last 5 year average up to community. Supply needs and management strategies. Again, I talked to you a little bit about this is some of the information that we get from the regional water planning groups. And so if we look at sources for new strategies in GMA 8 in 2020, we're looking at the last approved regional water plan for 2017. So what we're saying here is that of the needs in GMA 8, in other words, we've got demands that are projected and that were projected into 2020 today, or last year. That was 5 years ago. They were making these predictions. And so the strategies that were there to meet those needs and to increase water supply, most of them were met by transfers, transactions as they're categorized here. new reservoirs. Now this transfer transaction, that can be either the extension of a contract from, an entity to increase water supply, or multiple other things it could mean. More to the point here, we've got groundwater well development, which accounts for about 3% of that volume. So you can see that you're in the last approved state water plan for 2020. A lot of water was coming from new reservoirs, transfers from surface water, in different sources other than groundwater. 3% was coming from groundwater. Yes. Those are actually new reservoirs that are in place. Well, if at the time of planning, that would have been a new reservoir. And so it would have been in place and active for a strategy by 2020, which they were doing this. It wasn't then. It would be new in 2020. So it was planned to be online by 2020, but it wasn't. Any reservoir? Correct. These are 2020 strategies. So what you have is, if you see transfers and transactions, a lot of that would have come from existing reservoirs where they're increasing supply through the pipeline through an increased country. So the existing reservoirs are kind of in that big ground. There was something planned. I'm not sure. Now there are reservoirs under construction right now. There's a couple. Ralph Hall. Yeah. And they're actually moving forward now. Whether or not they met their schedule that was, put into the plan or not, I'm not quite sure. So again, if you look at that in a little bit different breakdown, what you have is 68% of that coming from surface water, 22% from reuse, and 3% from ground. That's in 2020. If you look to 2050, another way to look at it county by county throughout GMA 8 is to good pie charts. Now, this doesn't speak to the overall volume. It just speaks to the percentage of water for new strategies in 2050 that are coming from each of the 3 categories here: surface water, groundwater, and reuse. And so you can see that, in the northern part of GMA 8, there's a lot of water coming from surface water. Groundwater more prevalent for, the kind of outcrop areas to the west. And again, these don't speak to volume. Some of these volumes are pretty small. This is just as a percentage where the new water is coming from for strategies in 2050. If you look at the volumes, you see that most of these are fairly small volumes. Say if you go back to Comanche County, it's all blue. All the water's coming from groundwater. But if you look at the volume in this map, you see that that's about 400 and some odd. Thank you. Yes. No strategies in 2050. No new strategies in 2050. Yeah. So now we're looking at 2050, that first set of graphs and data for 2020. So there's some acknowledgement, at least for Ellis, in the planning, that there's going to be new surface water available and reuse, and that's what they're planning to use for the state. And then in other places, you can see that, for instance, Williamson County, that is a much larger number and bubble down there in that graph. It's in the south, the second county from the south end there. They're planning on using a lot of groundwater. And So again, just percentages, which tell you one piece of information, and then actual volumes, which tell you another. And you can see some of those counties don't have a lot of strategies for groundwater. Okay, socioeconomic impacts. In the last round of planning, the district spent a lot of time talking about impacts of lowering water levels on cost of production. Some of you guys that are involved with water production for water supply corporations, municipalities, y'all are very well aware of that, lowering pumps and all of those kind of things, decreasing well yields and potential need for additional wells, potential for additional costs from developing alternative supplies, the need to meet water supply to avoid impacts of water shortages. Obviously, there's both positive and negative socioeconomic impacts, depending on how you look at it and the table you're sitting on. And those were considered as you look at your management plans and rule updates. Y'all have already been through some of that. So I told you we were going to look at impacts on wells and sort of a real practical assessment across GMA 8 for what these, all of this water level decline means for the future. So again, it's a kind of a complicated graph, but it has a lot of good information on it. One of the things there, I'll start with the number down here on this axis. I think there's a little over 1,900 wells, public water supply wells throughout GMA 8 that we looked at for this assessment. And the assessment was, hey, what about the impact on public water supply wells? These, we've got water levels from 100 foot or so decline, multiple hundreds of foot of decline. What kind of impact are we going to have throughout the region as a whole? What we did in the last round of planning was we did a lot of runs. One of them was, hey, let's cut back the pumping let's look at our 2010 pumping. Let's cut it back to 70% of what it was. And let's see if that, helps us out. What kind of impact we have on existing wells if we did that. What that told us was we had, even when we cut back to 70% of what we were pumping in 2010, across GMA 8 as a whole, we still had a couple of hundred wells that were going to be impacted enough that you couldn't lower the pump enough. They needed to be re-drilled. They weren't necessarily dry, but water level was low enough that they couldn't be used. Okay, that's if you cut back to 70% of what you were using in 2070. Then we went to the other end of the spectrum and said, well, let's almost double the pumping, 1.9 times, 190% of the 2010 pumping, and let's see what impact that has. And this is just one way of looking at those impacts. Obviously, there's different impacts to spring flow. There's different impacts to a lot of different things for flow through the aquifer, et cetera. This is just one very practical measure of impacts that you see from different assumptions about how to manage the aquifer. And so what we see when you almost double the pumping is that by 2070, there would have been 1,100 of the 1,900 wells that were seriously impacted, couldn't be used as they would have had to been re-drilled, reconstructed, and it doesn't mean the aquifer was dry or that the wells were dry. It just means the way those wells were constructed, they would have had to been re-drilled. So it's just another insight, and could be classified as a socioeconomic impact of pumping the aquifer less, pumping the aquifer more. And so where we ended up in the last round of planning, as all the districts looked at what was required to meet their current needs, and what was required for to allow for some potential use of groundwater in their districts. You guys did the same things locally, and you adjusted pumping just like you did this time vertically, and you ended up with run 10. And run 10 ended up basically telling us that, yeah, we're going to have an impact out in 2070. We're going to have an impact on about 500 wells with that increased water level decline. Now, with the changes that you made, now that was in the last round of planning, with the changes you made in run 11, that run 11 is right there running with run 10. you've got about, yeah, probably, I don't know, 20, 30 more wells, maybe 50. I don't really know the exact number. It's a slight increase in the number of wells that are impacted. You're having a slightly larger impact on public water supply wells. A few more of them, because of that increased pumping, have trouble and would need to be reconstructed, rebuilt, whatever. So that's where you ended up in the last round of planning. And in this round of planning, our run 11 basically says pretty similar to where we were before. Going to have a little bit more impact, but y'all's tough job as decision makers, policy makers, is to find the balance between maximum practicable groundwater use and conservation and preservation. And this set of runs from high to low illustrate, demonstrate that you've been through that process, you've looked at the impacts, and you kind of come to a balancing point here in the middle with run 11. So any questions on that? Correct. Yeah, we have not looked at that specifically because it's a little harder to get good information on those. It might be something to do in the next round of planning. We're getting a better database thanks to those drillers that are entering data electronically now. For the last 20 years, we've gotten pretty good electronic data from the drillers database. So we have better information. We've got the best information on the public water supply wells, but most of them are engineered, and TCEQ keeps pretty good records. And so that's why we started with those 1900, figuring that they would have, you know, most impact on, you know, small cities, municipalities, but obviously there's impact to those smaller rural and domestic villages as well. We haven't quantified yet. Impacts on private property. Brian, I'll ask you to jump in here if you need to balance anything that's on this slide, but you know, chapter 36 talks to the impact to private landowners, water right holders of not being able to produce their water. And that's why, you know, you've worked with your legal counsel and set rules and management plan in place that tries to balance all that and allow people access to their water rights much you know, and at the same time balancing that with conservation, preservation, and considering all of those 9 factors as well. And so there's a lot of things to consider with the private property, and it most of the time there's a balancing act between, you know, trying to keep folks happy with those that want to conserve water, and they feel like that's their private property right versus those that don't. I'm told by some attorneys, and Brian here, you can jump in, but I'm told by some attorneys that when private property was mentioned in chapter 36, it's meant more for the protection of the private landowner to be able to produce or have a fair opportunity to produce the water. Opportunity to produce their water underneath their property. And certainly, y'all aren't the only district that has heard comments in regard to, I need access to my property. And so everybody's trying to find that balance. There was a lot of discussion about that at GMA 8 in this round of planning, and even more in the last round of planning as we step through all of those simulations. So DFC feasibility, we're almost done, guys. So the DFC feasibility, both from a physical achievability perspective, we try to make sure that these water levels and that the DFCs are achievable physically by using reasonable groundwater modeling tools to say, if we pump this much, we think our best estimate is that we're going to see this amount of drawdown, and we're not going to see, you know, massive differences across county lines that are unachievable. We're trying to do the best we can there. So that's the way we try to make sure they're physically achievable. And then regulatory achievability is another way to look at DFCs. And my question here is always for districts, you know, do you have rules in place? Do you have a management plan? Are you actively looking at how you're monitoring water levels and trying to hit those DFCs or make sure you don't overshoot DFCs with your drawdown. And all of those things are in place here and generally across GMA 8. So that's one of the questions you asked with regard to regulatory achievability. Again, we've stepped through a lot of stuff really fast here. Another thing we did at GMA 8 was just look at variance assumptions for the estimates coming from the model and how those might get built into the DFC statement. And then we ended up agreeing to tables that go into as an update to the explanatory report, which are called attachment B. And these contain all of the numbers, the drawdown numbers as were stated in the last explanatory report, and again here as the proposed DFCs. So those numbers you saw earlier for total drawdown 2080 for each of your counties, they're also, and for the districts, they're also included in these tables. The very first table up on the upper left here is by aquifer across the entire GMA 8 area. That's one way to state the DFC. The next table is by district, and then there is a table that starting on the lower right-hand corner here and continuing on to the next page that has each one of those estimates by county. There's still a lot of debate around the state throughout the industry as to how best to state DFCs, and so we've stated them 3 different ways here, and to try to give maximum flexibility to how to manage to meet those goals. Any comments on that? That's all I have, and that's your question. I guess first. I have it's not guaranteed that our rules assuming that as you can see, aquifer levels will continue to decline. I want to go back out here. Yeah. Correct. So why is there such a increase? We're looking at the Brian is their attorney, so he probably can talk more to that than I can. What we did was we took their estimates for anticipated increases in production and did that. Brian, during the last round of DFC development, I think it's fair to say that public entity was urging position did not prevail in GMAA of having lower DFCs already. When the rest of GMAA went with higher number, they stuck it out. So,
carved out from everybody else so that it's standalone figure. I think that they're. And they're still, I mean, the percentage is big, but their overall number. They do have the highest number of state. All domestic. They've got a 2 acre.
Are we talking about school?
I asked you a question about.
Oh. Water, yeah, water strategy. So 37 acre feet of groundwater strategies will propose to protect. Well, no, 37 acre feet. That's the total amount of groundwater, new groundwater that will be used in that decade. No, this is groundwater volume. Back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
I guess the question that I had. Water supplies, like ones in our county, sort of. That's their job to stay abreast of farm because that's what they do. The cities are different. Water is an issue in the city. It's not the health issue. Through the process, what we carry other resources for us to how do we educate our city? All cities sit down and look at this is their plan for the national plan. Big years. Especially that place area, southern part of that place, Johnson, the way you're going. That's a good. So how do we?
Raise region G contacts. Cities. Their uses and they get the feedback and then they bring HDR does all the computations and it brings it to region G to look at. And that's how it gets in the system. But if they don't ask for that, then most, like in Ellis County, I believe that surface water is the best way to go for them because the cost to treat water. That was in the past, but I don't know about today. But in the future. Yes, there is a mechanism where they submit that to them and then they submit back to Region G and it goes into the master plan. Yes.
So if I could dissect your question into two parts. Number one, how do they know how much water is available to them? It's through this process. The DFC process for regional water planning purposes, the high level planning that the state does in 16 different regions. By setting this DFC and assessing higher pumpage, lower pumpage, if you look at this table right here, if this proposed DFC passes and if the TWDB goes and does the MAG run, they come up with a MAG, model available ground. That number goes back into the regional water plan. The prairie lands and those aquifers, there will be 16,938 acre feet available for the regional water planning process for recommended strategy. People might pick alternate strategies with a MAG that's not, if it goes over that. Another detail. But bottom line is there's a feedback loop where the process you're doing here and model available groundwaters that end up coming out of these DFCs flow back into the regional water plan. They can't use more than that water. They can't say, well, prairie lands said we have 17,000 acre feet, but we're going to plan on using 100,000. They can't do that, not in the regional water plan. Now, your other question was master planning at cities and other places. Again, the regional water plans are important from the standpoint of getting funding from the water development. Every strategy in there, if they're going to go to TWDB for funding, then it has to be in the plan. So there's a feedback mechanism for this process that you're in the middle of right now, setting DFCs, looking at drawdown, and going, we can't pump 100,000, can't do it, and too much. So that 16,938 gets fed back into the regional water planning process. They won't plan for strategies that go above that. So this DFC is important, I always say, for long-term planning. It sets the pace for the future. Now, the other part of your question, I think, goes to how do you educate people? So, because that's just one part of the planning, right? The regional water planning and the strategies that we end up looking at here, it doesn't stop someone who wants to go get alternative funding or who lives in a county that doesn't have a district from doing whatever they want, right? And so there's multiple levels there. I wanted to explain the feedback loop. That was the first part of your question, I think. Then there's a whole other aspect of just educating people about the status of the aquifer, what the approach is, and how in general there needs to be other alternate water. The regional water planning process does a pretty good job of getting this feedback to them, but there's probably also still another education process for those things, those slivers of planning that happen outside of that covered pretty well.
Yeah, and I think, when you understand what's involved with the regional water planning process, and also kind of see what they have to do is take every water use. City of Washington, and they were required on a decadal basis to chart out exactly what their water demand growth is going to be, and a specific water management strategy, a source of water to meet that growth. So that's all included in the regional. So that was the whole purpose of bullet changing the planning process from the top down to the bottom up, to have all of those interests within the region, have a seat at the table, figure out what their demands were going to be, how they were going to meet them. So I don't know what the outcome is we can see each of those community, but they're typically pretty good. Getting with each of those water user groups gloves and charting out their demands and how they plan to meet them. They should know. Smaller users probably do.
I think you're reading see Ellis County. I don't think we have any city.
But their consultants should still be reaching out to the cities directly through the surveys for the water user groups to get that information from Public Works.
That's true. As far as representation on the group, it might stop at the county. But there may also be, in some cases, some water supply entities that are represented on the water front group. There should be.
Yeah.
And then, but lower than that, at the consulting level, and Water Development Board does a volunteers survey all the time, which consultants have access to. And then also the consultants try to, make the plans personally contact most of those entities that are, unless they're just really.
And I don't want to be dead on it, but I just want to make sure at least here now, the information of this process. Maybe it's some other entity. You're supposed to get that back. Water is huge. It's it, especially cities. And, I can count on one hand to have that, but I'm not bad at it. I'm just saying that's not unrelated. So, part of us, to me, part of us is the conservation district. I'm sure that's out everybody.
James, can I ask a question just for my own clarification? You mentioned, the counties where there's not a groundwater district, that it doesn't necessarily prevent them from making strategies outside of the plan, DFC, so forth. It's my understanding the GMA does set DFCs for those counties. Is that not limiting their ability for funding?
It limits their ability to use water.
They don't have to permit, but their funding is limited to that strategy.
Their funding, if they go to TWDB, would be.
I think I'm kind of misunderstood you earlier that it was kind of like an open checkbook to those areas.
Right. Well, if they're going for funding elsewhere, of course, there's no
Yeah, that's
district, so
secondary
there's no
funding.
permitting.
Right.
And if they have outside funding, then they're sort of.
But if they're going to the state,
Exactly.
They were
go to the
still-
state, they're still going to.
regardless if there's a GCD or not.
Still going to be a stopgap.
Some reason, each region has a representative. Small systems, municipalities, and all, there's agriculture. There's all these groups that set on that. Basically, they have the right to. All of that, and then it goes in EWDB, and then that's how each group gets their money, and then people like James.
And the consultants aren't allowed to use more than what's in the MAG for recommended strategies. Now, occasionally, alternate strategies, which aren't officially approved in the state water plan per se, they're just sort of out there. They can use more than MAG. But, again, if they go for funding, or if when the plan's updated and the MAG's not there, they might recommend it. Any other questions?
I think Maurice makes a good point. I mean, something we talked about sometime is coordinating and some water providers that understand that continue. I had a conversation with Wayne Owen a few weeks ago at the Parent Water District, that to make sure that it's on their radar screen that our rules and regulations will have effect of causing more water demand to be satisfied by surface water. Regional surface water providers know to be planning for lines to be coming down in this area. And he said they like to have that discussion. Because I think it's get out there years ago. The delayed reaction through the regional water planning process to understand more of the demand in these counties will be satisfied by sufficient planning to get a big well. I do think it's a little bit longer to have those discussions. You know, versus having somebody show up with an operating permit application. Year, 5 years. Big well. That's our alternative. Surface water lines. Operate under the compliance order, but somebody has to agree. So I think, you know, there's not too many entities to deal with who can bring big surface water lines.
So a couple of things back to what Brian said. I think right now there's about an 8-year lag between you setting the DFC and the MAG getting determined by what we're going to establish. These numbers you're developing today will go into not the plan that was just developed, might go into the yes, sir.
Once a new reservoir is identified and needed, what's the time associated with putting that into production?
I think the estimates I've heard recently are like 40, 50 years. From, and Brian probably has some permitting experience along those lines.
Land acquisition.
Based on what we're seeing with groundwater, it would appear to me that some of these works in progress right now. Sites.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the list of potential sites is in the entire state is fairly small. Most of us have already been built. We're all living on the work, 30s to the but there's only Texas side. Two that got permitted to get market.
No, Post Oak down with Brian, that was canceled. I mean,
Side.
So future use of surface water is limited by sites.
It is. Reuse water they've got.
And even brackish.
Desalinating brackish.
Chairman, I have also asked Sinclair to post a notice in the chat, online chat, should we have public comment, and we have no public comment.
Thank you. All right, I guess we'll move on to item 5, adjourn this public hearing. The public comment period, submission of written comments on proposed desired future conditions will remain open until 5 p.m. on February 14th, 2021. Do I have a motion to adjourn? A motion made and seconded to adjourn our public hearing. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, motion carried. We're now adjourned. We'll now take a 10-minute break. We'll be back for a regular board meeting. Thank you. Good morning. We call this regular board meeting of the Pearlands Board of Directors meeting to order. I'll declare it open to the public. Sinclair, would you call roll?
Director Beseda,
Here.
Director Kirk, Director Osborne, Director Tischler, Director McPherson,
Here.
Director Smith, Director Curtis.
Here.
We have a quorum present.
Thank you, Sinclair. Do we have public comments? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item number 4 then, consent agenda. I'll entertain a motion. Do I have a second? I have a motion made and seconded that we approve our consent agenda. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, motion carried. Move on to item number 5, administrative and financials. Kathy?
Thank you. We've had a short month since our last board meeting, but I'm glad to report that I have been working with our bookkeeping service to continue working on updates to the books. Also, if you'll notice that in your financials, it did not include a budget comparison because that's the next step we're going to do this week is update the system to include the 2021 budget. But we're moving forward, and I look forward to having those things resolved. And other than that, you might notice that I have closed out the building fund checking account following the construction of the new building. So that account was closed out with the remaining, I think there was 4,000 left in it. And I did move that to the money market. Other than that, if someone has questions for me, that would be all I have to report.
Any questions? Not. Thank you very much, Kathy. Move on to item number 6, update on public outreach activities, education, and conservation. Sinclair?
Good morning, everyone. Just a really quick update for everybody. Okay. Yeah, that might be a little bit better. So we mentioned at the end of last month's board meeting that we would be hosting a after hours business social here at the district office. So that was on January 19th, and that was through the Cleburne Chamber of Commerce. We had 30 people who attended this event, and they were able to get a tour of the building and take tours inside the water education trailer. And Kathy and I were there, and then Michael and Annette actually stayed and were able to visit with these visitors about their role in the district. So they kind of got a very all-encompassing interaction with our staff and learned more about the district. So it was a great event. Everyone was so interested in learning more about us, and they had a great time. On January 25th, I took the water education trailer to Keene Elementary School. So throughout the day, we had 74 fifth grade students that came through for demonstrations inside the trailer. They were able to come throughout the day in small groups at a time. And they were so eager to learn and ask great questions. And I think they were just excited to hear from someone other than their teacher and to not be on a Zoom call. So they were really excited. It was a great event. I'm just continuing to work on the annual report, the draft for that. And then I've got several events scheduled in the coming months and have been in outreach with some other contacts for future events as well. So if there are any questions, I'd love to answer them at that time, but that's all I have to report right now.
Any questions of Sinclair?
We do the outside.
No, sir. Like in terms of,
Updating with our, we've talked about that, and I think that's something we might want to consider since we relocated. And we've done, a really great-
Thank you, Sinclair. Okay, we'll move on to item number 7.
Would you like me to do that?
Go ahead.
Okay, the GMA has not met since November, and if y'all recall at the November 6th, well, beginning at November the 16th, that's kind of set the clock on GCDs to receive comments back to the each GCD to publish the proposed DFCs and begin receiving comments. And those comments are, to receive those again, as we discussed earlier, is through February the 14th, 5 p.m. And as you remember, following that, each GCD is to send a summary report back to the GMA by June 1st. And beginning then in June through late July, the GMA will hold meetings then to begin looking at these summary reports and consider final adoption of DFCs. And all this has to be done before January 5th, 2022. That deadline is in the statute. Maurice, you look like you have a question. Okay.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, we will move on to item number 8. And at this time, at 10:40 a.m., the board will recess in the closed executive session under section 551.071 Texas Government Code to consult with the district's legal counsel on item of today's agenda. No final action will be taken during closed session. At the conclusion of the closed session, the board will reconvene in open session. Reopen the meeting. Thank you. Okay, I will resume the regular board meeting at 11:28. And we will go on to item number 8.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Rules and Bylaws Committee met a couple of weeks ago to discuss this request about how certain small permittees, small volume permittees to continue to report semi-annually as they had done with temporary rules. And the committee found that given the smaller amount of conflict associated with the limited number of permits that fall within the class of permittees who have a permitted volume of less than 10 million gallons a year and are not public water systems, so they're not already reading meters and reporting on a monthly basis on the TCQ rules. That we would have a limited impact on the district's ability to manage the resources properly. And we found that it was generally good government to be responsible for some of these small users and allow them to report semi-annually instead of having to report out the district to get that money. So the committee recommended that in its representative resolution number 21-001 that you have before you. That the rules be amended to allow small public water system users permitted for less than 10 million gallons or less to be able to apply for semi-annual meter reading and reporting district with no fee for that application. And that it be viewed as a privilege under the rules if they don't comply with the semi-annual reporting. They would be put back at least for a period of 1 year on monthly reporting. If they've done that successfully for a year, they would be eligible to apply for semi-annual again. This committee's recommendation represented in the resolution to make that code change, go ahead and implement it by resolution today. And then as we identify some other small cleanup, perhaps the rule, we need to have pick that all up under one rulemaking proceeding later in the year. I'd be happy to answer any.
I have a motion that we approve resolution 21-001. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Resolution 21-001 passes. Okay. We will move on to item number 8.
For my general manager's report,
Number 9.
For my general manager's report, I had included in your packet, I did list that the House Natural Resources has made, we do have a new list on the House Natural Resources Committee, which Chairman Tracy King as chair of that committee for this session. Also included is some information today. One of the things we talked about in executive session is some enforcement items which staff will be sending out a show cause hearing notice, settlement agreement, possible settlement agreement. And other than that, unless someone has questions or comments regarding the information I provided, that would be provided.
Okay. Does anybody have questions? If not, we'll move on to item number 10. Council's report.
Thank you, Mr. President. Over the last month, I guess it hadn't been that long since our last board meeting. Worked on the Rules and Bylaws Committee on also met with district staff to go through permit applications, working review of those. Question mark applications. Some of the other. Also, I had mentioned earlier, finally on Thursday, Speaker of the House, Dave Phelan, appointed the committees in the House. And the big question was who's going to take over the committee that does groundwater and groundwater conservation. Selected Tracy King of Uvalde to head that committee. Following up on Larson. Great job on the committee. It's here. Chairman King is probably got more tenure on water issues than anybody that's represented. Started as a freshman on that committee in 1995 when I worked there for that committee. And other than 3 sessions that he wasn't in the legislature, he served on that committee 5 years. So he's very familiar with water issues, complexity, happening districts, and he's been a good friend of mine. Anyway, all of those committee assignments, both of the House representatives, the legislature has not done much. There's no really new big groundwater bills filed since our January board meeting, but we expect them now that the first 30 days will come to a close here this week. Start holding committee hearings, get busy with their business. I'll say this. I think all representatives, we got 4 representatives, I think, from our 4 different counties in this district. All of them did really well. Everybody's, many assignments, but I'll just all learn.
Brad. Move on to item number 7. Forum discussion, business for future meeting agendas. I had one committee assignments and the district committee assignments were last updated in 2018. And I visited with the general manager and she will be distributing updated list of committees this week for everyone to rank their preference and serving on. And assignments will be announced at our March board meeting. So y'all she'll send out a list of those committees and then y'all can rank them.
No, I'll get that out today. We'll make sure it happens.
Sometimes on this.
Okay, any other business for future meetings? If not, we'll move. Okay. This was made and seconded, we adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, motion carried. We've now adjourned at 11:37.